Hello, YouTube. This is Umills03. As some of you probably already know, I've had a YouTube channel for a number of years, for like probably over a decade. I think I got one in like 2007 or 2008, and then I started making YouTube videos pretty soon after then. But it wasn't until less than a week ago that I started filming videos for computer programming. So what I've been doing over the past 6 or 7 days, so I've been spending a lot of time doing is making programming videos for the Java programming language. So I essentially have a tutorial called Java Programming. It's a playlist of about 46 videos where I basically teach you everything from downloading the software program that you need in order to be able to write Java code to doing pretty serious, significant, interesting object-oriented programs. And then I thought to myself, well, I don't just know Java, I know Python as well. And so Python and Java are two common programming languages that new software engineers will typically learn and get accustomed to. And so what I'm going to be doing in this set of videos is teaching you guys the workings of the Python language. I already have a set of Java videos, but I figured the more the merrier. And some people will prefer to learn a particular language rather than another one. So what we can do is we can say that Python is very good for beginners. And so for beginning programmers, if you're just trying to learn the fundamentals of computer programming, Python is a great place to start. Because as you can see some of the code on my screen already, I'm going to show you in this video how to get here and how to download this software program so that you can start writing your own Python code. But as you might be able to see here, the lines are pretty short. Okay, so print of 6 times 2, we can probably guess what a line of code like that would do. But Python is pretty simple and these lines are pretty short. And a lot of the method calls that we're going to be doing are pretty intuitive. But the only thing I wanted to do in this video, I plan on making my tutorial videos about 20 minutes long. That's basically what my Java videos converged to after a while. So I hope to make these videos about 20 minutes long. I made about 45 videos for the Java tutorial. There are either slightly fewer things to say about Python just by virtue of it being a slightly simpler language, or I just feel like the concepts in the Python language are going to come a little bit easier. It's the syntax is a little bit more intuitive. So at the rate of doing 20 minutes of video, I'm expecting about 30 lessons of Python rather than the 45 that we have from Java. So it's not a tremendous difference, but there's a few things that I know how to do in Java that I don't know how to do in Python. And then as well, there's a few things that you have to do in Java that you don't have to do in Python. So declaring the data type would take a few extra minutes to explain with the Java programming language that you wouldn't need to learn if you were just doing Python. But what we're going to do is we're going to be working in an integrated development environment. So if you go to lesson 0 of the Java programming language, one of the things I described is that an integrated development environment is basically just a very fancy term for a software program in which code is written. And if you go to my Java videos, and if you look down at the bottom of my desktop right now, what you do is you see this little bird down here, and this is called Blue Jay. And so if you were writing code for Java, you would basically be in this kind of an environment. This is a software program where you can go view my Java videos. And we basically formed all of these classes with the exception of the screen unit test class here. That was sort of my own discovery there. But we made all these different classes, and I would encourage you, if you're interested enough in computer programming, to not just go through the Python tutorial, but also to go through the Java tutorial. And I don't know where my personal preference comes from, but I like Java a little bit more than Python. I don't know whether that means that, the language is actually better, or just because I'm more familiar with it since Java was my first language, so I've been writing code in it for longer. But I hope to be just barely enough of a wizard in Python that I could be competent enough to produce a YouTube compilation for the YouTube community. So that's what I'm going to be doing. Like I said, probably about 30 videos, and maybe in the span of those 30 lessons, as I'm filming them, if I learn more cool things just by doing some web searches, then we can expand the curriculum. But I'm hoping to prepare you for like an AP level, or maybe like a first or second semester, certainly first semester computer programming course. Okay. So what you're going to do before we can start writing Python code, remember this is the IDE for Java, so I don't want to get you distracted here. This is the IDE for Python. And so you can see in the current GUI and the way that it looks right now, it's a lot darker. And so it's sort of a black interface here, okay? And so different types of functions and different types of things in code are going to basically be color coded. They're basically different basic different representations of code has different instructions, or is manifest in a different way, then it shows up in different colors. But we need to figure out how to get this integrated development environment before we can actually start writing code. So one of the things I recommended in lesson 0 of the Java tutorial is to go ahead and use this search engine called Blackle. It's the same thing as Google. It's a custom search, but basically it just saves a lot of watt hours. So either it's better for the environment, and or it's going to save you pennies that you don't have to fork over to the electric company every month. But what you're going to do, we have basically different options for what integrated development environment we use to write code in a particular language. And so there's different IDEs for each language, right? For each of them, there's usually at least 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 that are pretty common. And so like I was saying, the IDE for Java is BlueJ. And so we wrote a lot of code in the BlueJ IDE in the Java tutorial. We're going to use an IDE called PyCharm. Okay, so it's called PyCharm. And if you look down at the bottom right of my screen, my arrow is hovering over that PC. It's a black box and it says PyCharm. And so that's the IDE, that's the software program that we're going to be opening every time we want to write Python code. So now what you would do is you would basically just want to go ahead and download the right version of PyCharm that you would need for your particular operating system. And what you're going to do is you can go ahead and Google that, you know, if you use Blackle or Google or whatever. And what it would do, what it would be is basically a link from JetBrains. Okay, so JetBrains is basically who is the entity that's responsible for producing this IDE. So what you're going to do is you would see a link. Maybe it's going to be the first link, but it says download PyCharm Python IDE for professional developers. Okay, so it should be a link from PyCharm. It's a pretty formal looking website, pretty official looking. And so what you would do is you would download the community version. Okay, so for the extent of the programming that we're going to be doing in this tutorial, the community version would probably be enough. So what you would go ahead and do is you'd figure out what download you needed. Okay, and if you want to do the professional, it just has basically a couple of extra build-ins, and I guess you could do a free trial. You would just have to remember to pull out before they start charging your credit card. But what you would have to do, I guess you would have to go ahead and download this, and then I would have to probably try to figure out what operating system you had. So maybe you would have to specify that. So it looks like you have Intel and Apple Silicon, whether you're talking about a PC or a Mac operating system. And so hopefully that's clear enough to you, and then it would go ahead and make that download. And I sort of regret doing that because now I just have to go ahead and delete it because you can see that I already had it downloaded on my computer. But in lesson 1, when we start printing statements in our first tutorial video, we're going to have PyCharm opened up. So for your homework assignment, or what I would recommend you do between lessons 0 and 1, is to go ahead and just do the exact same thing as we did in this video. Just Google PyCharm and download, and then you should download this integrated development environment. You should download this software program that's going to enable us to write code here in these programs and then print console output. And so we're going to see the effect that the lines of code that we write have on the output, on the console output. We're going to get different things according to the lines of code that we wrote, and that's software engineering, that's computer programming. So hopefully, I mean, this video wasn't going to be 20 minutes long. The only thing I wanted to do is explain what's going to happen in the videos going forward. I'm just going to share my understanding of the fundamentals. I think one of the things I did in lesson 0 for the Java stuff is share the topic list. And so I'm going to do that here. In Python, you know, this is a longer video than the Java tutorial, but that's okay. But for lesson 0, I just want to say that in Python, we're going to be talking about printing statements, comments, arithmetic expressions. It's going to run a pretty parallel curriculum to the Java stuff, right? There's going to be a lot of parallels. And the real difference is going to be the syntax. It's just going to be that the grammar and the formatting, it's just a little bit different in Python than it is in Java, but there are similarities, there are parallels. Almost every programming language has an if statement. Almost every programming language has functions, so variables. If you're familiar with those things already, going from your first to your second programming language is going to be quite a bit easier than starting your first one. So anyway, the topics that are going to be covered in this curriculum are printing statements, comments, arithmetic expressions. We're going to be talking about concatenating strings, escape sequences, printing new lines. We're going to talk about variables. User input. What if you wanted your program to depend on what the user entered rather than just having them get a standard console output every time they run your program? We could also have Boolean expressions. Those are basically true or false values. And then after we study that, we can then learn about if-else architecture, if statements and else statements, and how can we get our code to basically act differently according to the value of Boolean variables within the execution of the program. We're also going to have lists. So we'll talk about lists and data structures and ways to basically keep track of multiple elements in the same variable. Okay. And the nice thing about with Python is that we're going to have fewer restrictions in Python than Java about the data types that we feed into a list. So then that's going to happen. And then we're going to have while loops for each loops. We're going to talk about iterating code. And then we'll talk about the break and continue keywords, just as we did in Java. I believe that's lesson 14 of the Java curriculum. So not even quite halfway through. But then what we would do is go to functions. We'll talk about functions and doc strings. So having good documentation for the functions that you write. We'll talk about modules. Okay. The idea that you could import code that it basically increases the functionality of your program. And then we'll talk about exceptions. So the idea that you could throw errors and basically you could get your program to run in a particular way if you can forecast that there will be a runtime error as long as you call it out ahead of time. There's going to be file input and output. We're going to talk about writing and reading from files. We'll talk about dictionaries, sets, and tuples. We'll talk about string formatting and functions. How do you format words and sentences and paragraphs? We'll talk about numeric functions, lambda functions. There's going to be a fair amount of math that we're going to be doing. We'll talk about decorators and generators, just building up fancier and fancier functions that further increase the functionality of our programs. We'll talk about recursion, which is basically kind of a cool way of printing up multiple lines of code without using a loop, okay? And that's one of the paradigms that we discussed in Java, but we're going to see recursion in Python as well. We'll also talk about iter tools. So it's just more tools that are available as long as you import the right library. We'll talk about object-oriented programming. You know, basically, if you're talking about an introductory course, once you start talking about classes and instance variables and things like that, that basically represents the second half of that introductory course. So in the second half, we'll talk about object-oriented programming. We'll talk about inheritance, the idea of subclasses and superclasses. We'll talk about dunders, garbage collection, encapsulation, class methods, regular expressions, meta characters, function arguments, keyword arguments, tuple unpacking, the ternary operator, and then maybe a couple of paradigms on unit testing. So that's going to be about 30 videos, and this doesn't count as one of them. So hopefully you're excited to plow through a lot of new ground in Python material. I'm just going to be videotaping myself filming these videos, and I'm going to write example code and recommend that you try to replicate similar lines. And then we're going to go ahead and see what console output that we have. And then we're going to make small modifications and see what happens to the console output as a result of those small modifications that we make in our existing lines of code. So that's what we have going on here, and we're going to talk about packages. We're going to talk about basically the entire Python curriculum as you would see it found online. So you can either go to a website and try to parse through this stuff on your own, or for free, you can just listen to me sort of explain it verbally. And I think that that's what's going to be the most helpful, is if you can hear someone explain the concepts, and then also go ahead and download the PyCharm IDE and make it interactive and just really try to follow along rather than just passively watching these videos, because these are not supposed to be leisurely. They're supposed to be informative and instructional and fun. But what's going to be the most fun is for you to do it on your own rather than take my word for the concepts and what would happen conceptually. So I think that's enough for this video. So in the next video, we're going to be starting with printing statements. So we're just going to go ahead and click the PyCharm down here. Literally, I'm going to be sharing my screen in lesson 1, and this is where we're going to be at. So between then and now, you should get comfortable downloading the PyCharm, and then we're going to start fresh with a new project in the next video and figure out how we start printing statements. So I think that's enough for now. Hopefully you're excited to learn the Python curriculum. And again, just another plug, go ahead and check out my Java videos as well. Java is a similar programming language, and I'm going to give pretty similar quality treatments of both languages. If you want to learn Python, just see the Python videos. If you want to learn Java, just see the Java videos. If you want to compare and contrast both languages, which I recommend you do if you have the time for it, go ahead and do that. And that's going to open up doors for you even further. So I think that's enough for this video. Hopefully you're excited to get going with this, and I'll see you in lesson 1 when we start talking about printing statements, writing comments, and then maybe a couple of basic arithmetic expressions. That'll be the first of about 30 lessons in our curriculum. So from UMills03, thanks for watching, and please subscribe.